மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
We move on now to the famous 4 pawns attack, which is definitely one of White's most aggressive anti-Alekhine weapons, but in my view it's by no means his best. And Black has several good ways to drum up counterplay against this system. Often the White pawn setter can become unwieldy and difficult to defend. Nevertheless, Black has to be very precise, or he can find himself permanently cramped. So this is the major challenge against the 4 pawns attack, to avoid cramp. White does best in this system when he doesn't try to attack immediately. Instead, he uses the pawns as a distinct cramping influence on the Black's position. Now, for practical reasons, I'm going to recommend, how can I put it, one of the lesser main lines against the 4 pawns attack, a sharp and dangerous response which White could well be unfamiliar with. There's very little theory on this particular variation, and it gives Black very interesting counterplay. And we're going to kick off the investigation by looking at a game, Volshin versus Svechnikov. This game was played in Russia in the year 1988, and our response starts with the move d takes e5 and continues with c5, which is one of the most sharp ideas that Black can employ against the 4 pawns attack. Now, in general, in this position, White pushes by. I don't think he gains anything from allowing Black to take on d4, and the only other move in this position is the crazy looking move d takes c5, after which queen takes d1 check, and then the excellent move knight a4 ensures Black a really good position. There's no real way for White to continue to defend those pawns. Bishop e3 allows knight takes b2. If White goes b4, Black has, excuse me, he doesn't have a6, he has a5, and the point of this move will be seen after a3 when Black takes on b4, and then he lands knight c3 check on White, which is the main point in putting the knight on a4 in the first place. So going back to c5, if White wants anything in this position, he's got to push on with d5. And now we're going to play our favoured response. That's pawn up to g6. Now, what can we say about g6? Well, Black's theme is to bombard the White centre with pieces. The bishop will come to g7. The e5 pawn could well turn out to be weak. It's very important for Black to continue to rain blows on that pawn. Usually knight f3 is answered by bishop g4 in this system. Most often Black has to play e6 to soften up the White pawn centre. The advantage of playing this move is that there is an enormous amount of theory on this, so to a certain degree you're throwing the opponent onto his own resources. Let's just see how this game, Volshin versus Svechnikov, continued. Well, White played bishop f4, Black played bishop g7, and then White brought his knight out to c3, which is by far the most common sequence. Going back to g6, you might wonder whether there was any mileage in not putting the bishop on f4 in this position, for instance preferring bishop e3. Well, against that, I think Black should just simply castle and allow White to take on c5. Point of that is that when White does take on c5, Black plays the excellent move knight 6 to d7. In many ways these positions remind me of a modern defence, or even the Grinberg defence, where Black has to play very sharply, but by so doing he smashes up the White centre. And well, as you can see, after bishop d4, knight takes e5, Black has a pretty comfortable position already. Going back to knight c3, bishop g7, White might also try knight f3. I think this is what a lot of unfamiliar players who are unfamiliar with this variation will play. After that, bishop g4 is definitely the best move. And then if White plays bishop f4 here, Black gets the chance to play knight 8 to d7, and already White is having serious problems holding his centre together. So that's how quickly a Black counter-attack against White's centre can develop in this line if White gets it wrong. So by default almost, Bishop f4 and then knight c3 has been established as the most accurate sequence. Black castles, and now queen comes up to d2. Well, of course, around here, just taking that move back, white can consider other moves. What's been played? Well, two moves of the bishop on f1 have also been played here. Let's take a look at bishop to d3 first. Well, against that, e6 should definitely be the challenge, and that's already slightly awkward for white because he doesn't want to take on e6. If he leaves it, his pawn on d5 is unprotected, and therefore bishop d3 looks faintly ridiculous against that scenario. So the only move really to make any sense at all in this position is d6, knight f3, knight c6, knight f3, and now the excellent move here, knight d7. And as you can see, black is already creating very serious pressure against the pawn. White's got only one decent move to protect that pawn, queen e2. And now comes knight into d4. And I think this move will ensure black very serious counterplay. We're following the game Cifullette versus Sedina, played in St Vincent, 1998. There white took the knight and played knight b5. Black brought her queen out to a5 check. Bishop came back to d2, and then the queen went to b6. As you can see, already there's pressure against the e5 pawn. And what is white to play? If she goes bishop f4, a6 could be embarrassing, or knight c5 is interesting too. If, as in the game, white tries to be ambitious with the move b4, I think black can simply take that pawn. And after c5, knight takes d3 check, queen takes d3, queen c6, castles e5. Black was already much better with that mobile central pawn majority, and it must be noted, a clear extra pawn. Added to which, well, let's face it, this bishop is potentially extremely strong. So going back to the position after castles, what else? Well, white can also try bishop e2 in this position. After that, the game Muraru versus Grinberg, Bucharest 1999, went on as follows, the traditional e6. This move is very common in this line. Knight f3, once again black takes on d5 and bishop g4. This would be a typical method in this system. White castled. Again, black starts creating pressure against that e5 pawn, pressure which is not at all easy to resist. White tried queen to f1, black hoovered off the knight on f3. And now the excellent move, knight takes e5. And this more or less refutes white's opening strategy. White took, but then rook e8. And now we see white is really struggling in this position. The further moves, queen f2, bishop takes e5, queen takes c5, rook c8, did nothing to dispel the assessment that black is much better in this position. White went queen f2, bishop takes c3, black takes a pawn off, rook a d1, and now queen d6 safely blockading the passed pawn, with an extra pawn and a much better position for black. So I think what we're learning already, if we go back to the position after queen d2, it's that it's not at all easy for white to hold his centre together in this variation. Unsuspecting white players could easily see their position falling apart with the help of well-timed blows such as e6, bishop g4, and black keeping a focus firmly on those central pawns, particularly the vulnerable pawn on e5. So queen d2 is almost certainly the best move, and black usually attacks the centre with e6. We'll see an alternative to this this type of play in a moment, but anyway, for the time being, black plays e6 and vulturing castles on the queen side. Just dropping back, there is an alternative here after d6. Once again, it's not really surprising to see what black is doing. He brings his knight out to c6, and now white hopes that he can bring his knight out to f3 in comfort. Well, after this, black has two interesting possibilities. He can hit at the centre straight away with f6. That's certainly an interesting move. And then if white castles on the queen side, just take on e5. Then comes bishop to g5, queen to d7, knight e4, and then black gets to put his knight in on d4, creating room for the black queen on c6. Something like this. That's one possibility. If you don't like that, going back to knight f3, black can also consider knight d7, hitting the pawn 3 times. White can defend that pawn with queen to e3. f6 again, I would say indispensable in this position. Keep hammering away at that pawn. And now white castles. Well, let's see. What have we got? We've got knight d takes e5 in this position. Takes, knight takes, queen takes, bishop d7. Bishop takes e5, f takes e5, king b1, and then bishop c6. Perhaps this is another approach. Okay, white's got a strong passed pawn on d6, but his king is not yet fully safe. And black has very strong piece activity. The bishop on c6 is particularly strong. So there are two approaches against d6 which I believe hold out some promise for black. Hence, if we go back, again we come to castles and the main line. Alright, well black takes to free up his bishop. C takes d5. And now bishop out to g4. Let me take a quick sip of coffee here. You know, chess-based coffee is very good. Okay, bishop to g4. And now rook to e1. And this move is given an exclamation mark in most opening textbooks. White is refraining from develop the knight on g1 so as to avoid giving black a target. And Volshin recounts that up until this point he was following a book recommendation and he was quite satisfied with the opening, because according to his book, white was clearly better. Just going back, it's easy for white to play knight f3 check, but I think that's actually an imprecision, because it's not clear to me how after knight 8 to d7 white's even going to contemplate holding that pawn. There's no way white can hold that e5 pawn. So it's got to be more or less rook e1. And now comes c4, a move which Volshin recounts surprised him, a move which was not actually in his book. And it's a move which repairs a pawn sacrifice, which may well change the evaluation of this particular position from good for white to otherwise. Well, white played h3. That has become established as the main line. It's worthwhile noting that white can play bishop h6 in this position, but it's not particularly good after bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, knight takes d5. Why not grab that pawn? Pawn up to h3, bishop f5, rook d1, and the very interesting move here, knight takes c3. Point being that after rook takes d8, knight takes a2 check's very interesting. And black has sacrificed his queen, but in return he's got pawns, he's got roving pieces, and he's got a naked white king as compensation. So perhaps bishop h6 is ill-advised. So you can see white has plenty to think about in this position. Hence the move h3. And now comes bishop f5, preparing this pawn sacrifice. When white plays g4, black's going to plunge his bishop into d3. And that's an offer more or less white can't refuse. Well, just going back, there was a game, Axelrod versus Grinberg, played in Jerusalem, 2005. It's noteworthy because white did not play g4. Instead, he played the more restrained knight f3. We should see this game, I feel, not only because it's one of the more recent examples of this system in practical play, But secondly, because it illustrates black's chances in a position where white is apparently playing decent moves, you know, as opposed to the sharpest and virtually the only move to keep any hope of advantage. Knight came to d4. The bishop comes into d3. So the same type of sacrifice, except this time white's got to worry about that vulnerable pawn on d5. So it's not quite so simple. White can take twice on d3, then black gets the chance to take on d5. So this perhaps explains why white lurched forward with d6. Okay, knight comes into c5. I think already it can be seen that black has a pretty good game here. Axelrod played bishop e2. Next stage was to bring the rooks to bear against the white centre. Knight b to d7. Once again, we see that pawn on e5 is very, very vulnerable. So vulnerable, in fact, that well, after knight d5, knight takes e5. Black was already in the ascendancy. Knight e7 check was played. Okay, this forces an exchange sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice which is actually very good for black. So the queen comes to e7. I mean, just look at those black minor pieces, the two knights and the bishop. They're crawling all over white's position here. Bishop takes e5. White's trying to bail out with the help of tactics. He wants to take on b7 in this position. Very sharp move, creating the preconditions for the move knight c6. Does it work? c3. An excellent response. And now I think white is in very serious bother. B takes c3 was played. Queen takes b7. And now we see the point of that move c3. White is unable to take on e5. So the upshot of it is after queen takes b7, white is just basically lost in this position. He's lost the battle of the tactics. But the battle rages even further after bishop f5 with the idea of knight to d3 check. Knight comes to b4. Of course, this can only be a helpless sort of try. a5 is very easy. Opening up the white king. Continuing to open up the king. Queen penetrates to the back rank. And then every black piece joins the party. White resigned. What can I say about that game? I mean, again, white played very plausible moves, but he was completely crushed by black's piece activity. So that's what might happen. That was the game Axelrod versus Grinberg, Jerusalem 2005. That's what can happen if white doesn't go g4, which brings us conveniently back to the Volscian game. And now comes the pawn sacrifice with bishop to d3. All right, well, black's ideas in this position. Well, first of all, he's attacking d5. This means white can't remain neutral. Second idea is to bring the knight into the game via a6, and then either to b4 or to c5. Third idea, after the knight moves, is to play rook to c8, and by so doing, create immediate pressure against the white king before white can get any of his kingside pieces into the fray. This is a pawn sacrifice which white should accept, and he did accept in this game. So off came the pawns, and then knight to a6. So black's a pawn down, but the compensation is fairly obvious. He leads in development, his knights are very active, and white's king is unsafe. Now knight b4, of course, is a direct threat. So white plays d6. All right, rook to c8, perfectly understandable. King comes to b1, and now knight c4, with the immediate idea of queen to b6. I mean, you have to understand that a lot of your opponents are going to have to get here in the first place. You know, it's not at all easy to get here, to negotiate black's early pressure against in this system. But just to get here is tough enough. But now with queen b6 on the horizon, white's got a difficult defence. All right, well, knight d5 was played. Fairly forced, I would say, but of course that takes away another defender from the white king. And black brought his queen out to a5. Knight check on e7, hoping to pick up that rook. King goes into the corner, And now knight f3. Note that white had no time to take the rook, because his own rook on e1 was on pre. So white's more or less got to develop his knight in this position. And now black play rook c5 in the game. Just going back, as an improvement, a possible improvement on that game, Volshin suggests knight takes b2 for black. And in fact, this does look very interesting. One of the main points of this move is that if white takes, black puts his knight on b4. White's only got one move here, queen to b3, to stay in touch with a2. And then black brings down the rook to c2 check. Well, I don't know about you, but this looks rather worrying from where I'm sitting. And if king b1, rook takes a2, gives black a very strong attack. I mean, I would not like to be white in this position. For instance, one idea would be for white to try and get his rook into the game, but I think there, rook c3 is just a crushing move. I don't see how white's going to defend himself against that. Point being that if white plays a move like queen c4, the queen has left the roost, and then black just comes in and gives checkmate. That would be a very brief example of how black can do some real damage in that variation. So knight takes b2 was a possibility. Going back to the game, rook c5 was played. White played h4. Probably a mistake. Well, going back, what should white play? According to Volshin, queen to b3 was the only move there. And then once again, we get interesting play after knight takes b2. Well, the motivation behind that's obvious. Black wants to play rook b5. So the complications are quite interesting. I think there's only one move after knight takes b2, and that's bishop to d2. Don't think the knight can be taken. After bishop d2, queen a4. This is one position at least where black is happy to exchange the queens. Rook e3. Rook comes to b5. Queen takes a4. Knight takes a4, discovered check. Rook b3. You can see already these complications are considerable. And then knight 4 to c5. And Volshin just thinks this is a very unclear endgame position. I mean, I would have to agree. It's difficult to say exactly what's going on here. Black seems to have as many chances as white. It's not clear whether those central pawns are strong or weak. They're well blockaded. Black's got f6 coming up. He's got potential pressure on the queen side. b3 is on pre. It is very messy. And if that's the best white's got, then maybe rook c5 is just as good a practical try as knight takes b2 there. Certainly an interesting position. Okay, well, white played h4. Probably missing black's move, which was pretty spectacular, I think you'll agree. Queen takes a2 check. Attractive. Not too difficult to spot, but nevertheless very attractive. It's got to be taken. Knight comes into b4 check. And now king b3. Knight takes d3. And it may seem as though, you know, huge material losses are unavoidable for white. But white got a bit lucky in this position. It turns out he's still got some resources with the move h5. And that's the only chance to fight. I mean, otherwise white's position is disintegrating. His king's weak, his rook on e1's on pre, the bishop on f4 is on pre. Nevertheless, h5. And actually it turns out that this move confuses black so much, he misses a win in this position. Now, let's first of all see what happened in the game. Black played g takes h5. Just going back, what was the winning move? Well, according to Volshin, knight takes f4 was the win. Black probably got afraid of that move because of h takes g6. But f takes g6, it seems, is good enough. And white has nothing for the piece in this position. Just turns out it's one of those situations where White's got these impressive looking central pawns, but they're not really going anywhere. White plays e6 in this position. Simply knight takes d6. And if he doesn't play e6, black is gradually going to recuperate. So, as I said, after h5, it's hard to say why black didn't play knight takes f4. Maybe he was in time trouble, maybe he panicked. Maybe he intended to go knight takes f4 after g takes h5. But, well, let's just see what happened, because rook takes h5 was played, and now black played knight takes f4. And it's hard to see what difference this makes until you see the saving grace, rook takes h7 check. That was perhaps the point that that black missed. Well, okay, a move has been played which is forced but strong. It's got to be taken. Rook h1 check. Bishop h6 only move, and now white gets the chance to land some tactics of his own with knight g5 check. King comes to g7. Knight comes to f5 check. King g6, and apparently black had calculated to here, and he thought he was actually escaping. But as Volzhin recounts, quite an unpleasant surprise awaited black in this position. Yep. Knight h7. The saving grace. And now, quite interestingly, after knight d2 check, we suddenly arrive at a position where the earlier king b3 turns out to be useful. Because, of course, if white's king was on b1 in this position, then it would be mating two moves on the a file. So, remarkably, white can play king a4 in this position, and this seems to bail him out, because it's difficult for black to avoid the perpetual. I mean, in the game, black played king takes h7, rook takes h6 check was played, king g8, and then we got this exciting perpetual check mechanism with knight e7 check and knight f5 check, which I think you'll agree with me is a little bit lucky from white's point of view. But that would be nothing to what would happen to black if he tried to play for the win in this position. Let's say with rook c4 check. And then after b4, try the crazy looking move knight h5. This is also quite an interesting variation. After that, the point of knight h5 is that after rook takes h5, rook takes g4, it seems as though there are far too many white pieces on pre for his own good. But, well, let's just see. Rook takes h6 check, king takes f5, knight takes f8, king takes e5, knight d7 check, king f5, rook f6 check, king e4, knight c5 check, d7, and after all these bewildering complications, it turns out that it's now white who stands to win this position and not black. It's a remarkable turnaround. So, back to the game, and knight f5 check. Well, the two players agreed to draw. There's one more move. King g8, knight e7 check. Draw agreed. So, a very exciting game where white...